Committee on the Judiciary, Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess to the subcommittee at any time. I welcome everyone to today's hearing on discrimination and violence against Asian Americans. Before we begin this meeting, I would like to ask that we have a moment of silence in memory of the individuals tragically killed, murdered in Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you. I'd like to remind members that we have established an email address and distribution list dedicated to circulating exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members may want to offer as part of our hearing today. If you'd like to submit those materials, the site is judiciarydocs@mail.house.gov. We will distribute them to members and staff as quickly as possible. Also ask unanimous consent that our Judiciary Committee colleagues, Representatives Jha, Paul, and Lou, participate in today's hearing. Hearing no objection, I welcome them to our subcommittee. You'll be able to question our witnesses if they are yielded time by subcommittee members. Finally, I would ask all members, both those in person and those appearing remotely, to mute your microphones when you're not speaking. This will help prevent feedback, other technical issues, and unmute yourself when you are recognized. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. While there's still many details to be learned about Tuesday's horrific shootings in Atlanta that left 8 people dead, 6 of them reportedly of Asian descent, one thing is certain. For many Asian Americans, Tuesday's shocking events felt like the inevitable culmination of a year in which there were nearly 3,800 reported incidents of anti-Asian hate incidents that grew increasingly more violent over time as the COVID-19 pandemic worsened, and some people wrongly blamed Asian Americans, or implied such by calling it the China virus. These incidents include cases of verbal harassment, being spat at, slapped in the face, lit on fire, slashed with a box cutter, or shoved violently to the ground. And that number of reported incidents is just likely the tip of the iceberg. I want to make clear that all Asian Americans who are understandably feeling hurt and afraid right now and wondering whether anyone else in America cares, that Congress sees you, we stand with you, and we will do everything in our power to protect you. Any Asian hate did not begin with the COVID-19 pandemic and will not end when the pandemic is over. All the pandemic did was exacerbate latent anti-Asian prejudices that have long and ugly history in America. It also provided an excuse for some to act on those prejudices. In fact, there have been discrimination against lots of people in this country, and all of that has been exacerbated. But the Asian situation has been the most extreme. Pandemics, wars, geopolitical tensions, and economic competition, and the fear and resentment that these situations create have historically provided the conditions for anti-Asian racism and xenophobia to take root, often leading to tragic consequences for Asian Americans. For example, social and economic resentment against Chinese laborers in the 1800s led to the enactment of Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred nearly all immigration from China. And the 1924 Immigration Act effectively barred immigration from all Asian countries. In 1942, the United States government committed the most sweeping violation of civil liberties in American history, other than slavery itself, when it ordered the forced internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of them second and third generation Americans, during the Second World War, based not on any legitimate national security concerns, but on the racist and xenophobic assumption that Americans of Japanese ancestry would be disloyal. In 1982, Chinese American Vincent Chin was beaten to death by 2 white auto workers because his attackers thought he was Japanese and therefore responsible for the decline of U.S. automobile industry. On September 15, 2001, Balbir Singh Sodhi, a Sikh gas station owner in Arizona, was murdered by a man who blamed him for the 9/11 terrorist attacks. To this list, we now add the most recent victims of anti-Asian hate, as Asian Americans are wrongfully blamed for the COVID-19 pandemic. While many of the recent anti-Asian incidents may not meet legal definition of hate crime, these attacks nonetheless create an unacceptable environment of fear and terror in Asian American communities. Attacks like the one on 84-year-old Visha Ratanapakdi on January 28 of this year was on a walk in his neighborhood. He was walking in his neighborhood and was violently slammed to the ground. He died a few days later from the brain trauma that he sustained. I'd now like to play a video of that attack caught by a nearby surveillance camera. Sadly, this incident was one of several recent ones where elderly Asian Americans were similarly knocked violently to the ground. Left unchecked, racist attitudes stoked by racist rhetoric can have deadly consequences for innocent people, as we've just witnessed in that sad clip. In such a fraught time as the ones we're living in, it is incumbent on all public officials, elected or otherwise, and public figures to speak out against the irrational hatreds and prejudices that could overtake society in the face of a national emergency. In short, words matter. Indeed, the wrong words can be very harmful. Leaders who promote stereotypes to use rhetoric aimed at a particular ethnic or racial group can cause increases in levels of discrimination or violence directed against that group. When politicians use terms like China virus or Kung flu or refer to COVID-19 as the effect, to refer to COVID-19 as the effect, intentional or not, of putting a target on the backs of all Asian Americans. Used the right way, however, words from our leaders can help calm fears, reassure those feeling under threat, and remind everyone that we all share the same basic dignity as human beings and that we should treat each other accordingly. Thankfully, we have two panels of witnesses who can help show us the way forward and eagerly await their testimony. As best we can tell, the last time there was a congressional hearing specifically focused on anti-Asian hate was in 1987, before this subcommittee. That hearing took place during another time when economic and social problems were being blamed on an Asian country, and by unfair extension, Asian Americans. We can't ever forget Asian Americans, not Asians, Asian Americans. Clearly, more work needs to be done. Let us use this hearing as a chance to do better. Now I'd like to recognize, the ranking member's not here. Mr. Roy, are you taking his place? In lieu of Mr. Johnson, Mr. Chip Roy of Texas will give the statement for the minority as the ranking member. You're recognized for 5 minutes, Mr. Roy.
Well, thank you, Chairman Cohen, and I appreciate our gathering here today. This is obviously an important subject matter. And to be clear, all Americans deserve protection and to live in a free and secure society. The fundamental nature of what we expect out of government, right? Secure the blessings of liberty, as we say in the Constitution of the United States. The victims of race-based violence and their families deserve justice. And as the case, what we're talking about here with the tragedy, what we just saw occur in Atlanta, Georgia. I would also suggest that the victims of cartels moving illegal aliens deserve justice. The American citizens in South Texas that are getting absolutely decimated by what's happening at our southern border deserve justice. The victims of rioting and looting in the streets last week, businesses closed, burned, last summer, deserve justice. We believe in justice, right? There's old sayings in Texas about, find all the rope in Texas and get a tall oak tree. We take justice very seriously, and we ought to do that. Round up the bad guys. That's what we believe. My concern about this hearing is that it seems to want to venture into the policing of rhetoric in a free society, free speech, and away from the rule of law and taking out bad guys. And as a former federal prosecutor, I'm kind of predisposed and wired to want to go take out bad guys. And that's bad guys of all colors. That's bad guys of all persuasions. That's bad guys targeting people for all different reasons. And I think we need to be mindful of that. And so now we're talking about whether talking about China, the Chi-Coms, the Chinese Communist Party, whatever phrasing we want to use, and if some people are saying, hey, we think those guys are the bad guys, for whatever reason. And let me just say clearly, I do. I think the Chinese Communist Party running the country of China, I think they're the bad guys. And I think that they are harming people, and I think they are engaging in modern-day slavery, and I think that what they're doing to the Uyghurs, and I think that what they're doing targeting our country, and I think that what they're doing to undermine our national security, and what they're doing to steal our intellectual property, and what they're doing to build up their military and rattle throughout the Pacific, I think it's patently evil and deserving of condemnation. And I think that what they did to hide the reality of this virus is equally deserving of condemnation. And there's hardly any getting around that in fact happened, right? We've got, the World Health Organization, on Twitter saying preliminary investigations conducted by the Chinese authorities have found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission of the novel coronavirus. WHO had to go back and redo all of that. We know full well, I've got a bill that I introduced to posthumously award a Congressional Gold Medal to Dr. Li Wenliang for coming out and exposing what the Chinese Communist government had done to hide the virus. Dr. Wenliang was a 34-year-old ophthalmologist in Wuhan, China, who died from the 2019 coronavirus after he sought to draw attention to the spread of the virus. Research indicates the first patient infected exhibited symptoms in early December 2019. On January 3rd, after raising concerns about the spread, Dr. Wenliang and 7 other doctors were detained and questioned by Chinese officials. He was forced to sign a statement retracting his warnings and confessing he had spread illegal rumors. That's the reality, and he ended up dying, but he was beaten. They were targeted for engaging in free speech, for trying to bring to light what was happening. And that's the reality of what I tend to refer to as the Chi-Coms. And I'm not going to be ashamed of saying I oppose the Chi-Coms. I oppose the Chinese Communist Party. And when we say things like that, and we're talking about that, we shouldn't be worried about having a committee of members of Congress policing our rhetoric, because some evildoers go engage in some evil activity as occurred in Atlanta, Georgia. Because when we start policing free speech, we're doing the very thing that we're condemning when we condemn what the Chinese Communist Party does to their country. And that's exactly where this wants to go. This is the road this wants to head down. And nothing could be more dangerous than going down that road. Because who decides what is hate? Who decides what is the kind of speech that deserves policing? A panel? A panel of this body? A panel in the executive branch? A panel of the Department of Justice? And then what does that mean? Who's deciding? When we get into making crimes out of thought, crimes out of speech, as opposed to crimes out of the actions of evildoers. Find those who perpetrated what happened in Atlanta. Find those who engage in hate of all forms, and punish the absolute hell out of them. But don't go around policing thought. And I'd add one other thing. I hope today's hearings will examine this discrimination against Asian Americans in educational settings, a matter that the Trump administration prioritized, took seriously, and acted upon. In October, for example, the Department of Justice sued Yale for race and national origin discrimination after determining that Yale was non-compliant with Title VI of the '64 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits federal financial assistance to any program engaged in racially discriminatory practices. Following a 2-year investigation, the Department of Justice concluded that Asian American and white students have only 1/10 to 1/4 of the likelihood of admissions as African American applicants with comparable academic credentials. The Justice Department alleged that Yale discriminated against Asian Americans by favoring certain applicants based upon their race, rather than looking for race-neutral alternatives to achieve the university's goals. The then Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division explained, all persons who apply for admission to colleges and universities should expect and know that they will be judged by their character, talents, and achievements, and not the color of their skin. To do otherwise is to permit our institutions to foster stereotypes, bitterness, and division. I couldn't agree more. However, only 2 weeks into President Biden's term, the Biden administration suddenly reversed course and dropped the lawsuit against Yale. Mr. Chairman, I'll close, but I'll just say I hope this is the direction we'll go. I hope we'll look at this and we'll look through the lens of clarity and objective truth, trying to seek justice and not trying to police speech, and trying to achieve the objectives we want to achieve. And I thank the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. And before I recognize the chairman for his statement, I'd just like to reiterate that while speech is important and has meaning, the incidents I mentioned in my opening statement were being spat at, slapped in the face, lit on fire, slashed with a box cutter, and shoved violently to the ground as the video showed. That's not speech.
Oh,
That's
Mr. Chairman, I didn't suggest it was speech.
That's not speech, that's action. I'd like to recognize the chairman for his opening statement, Mr. Nadler.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, we're here today to address the horrific rise in violence, harassment, and discrimination against Asian Americans that is surging across the country. As we convene this hearing, our thoughts are with the victims, but especially the Asian American victims in Georgia who were brutally murdered on Tuesday night. Although the motive is still to be investigated, the effect on the Asian American community has been profound, and it is certainly appropriate for us to address the fear gripping the Asian American community. So I want to thank the chairman for convening this hearing. Hate crimes and hate incidents against Asian Americans have been on the rise since 2017. Last year alone, nearly 3,800 incidents were reported, with about 68% of Asian Americans reporting that they have experienced racial slurs or verbal harassment since the pandemic began. Distressingly, one of the largest increases in the country of hatred and violence against Asian Americans has occurred in my own congressional district in New York City. This short clip shows just some of the verbal and physical abuse many Asian Americans have faced in recent years.
A wave of violent, unprovoked attacks against Asian Americans consuming the city of New York. A 56-year-old man in Manhattan this week pummeled for no apparent reason. A man riding the subway sliced across his face from cheek to cheek. A woman viciously shoved in Queens. A 71-year-old woman punched in her face in Chinatown. A 36-year-old man stabbed in the back, now fighting to stay alive.
Last February, a woman was hit in the face on the subway and called diseased. Last March, a Chinese-American dad from Queens and his 10-year-old son were harassed and attacked by an assailant who was screaming at him for appearing to be Chinese. Last April, an Asian-American woman in Brooklyn suffered significant burns after a chemical attack. Last July, an 89-year-old grandmother in Bensonhurst was attacked and set on fire by two men. Just last month, a New Yorker was slashed across the face with a box cutter. He needed more than 100 stitches. Also last month, in separate incidents on the same day, two elderly women were punched in the face on the subway. A few weeks ago, a man was stabbed outside of the federal courthouse. And just this Tuesday, a woman in Midtown had an unknown liquid poured on her neck as she was picking up packages. The common denominator? All of the victims were Asian American or of Asian descent. These are our neighbors, our friends, our family members, our constituents, and fellow Americans. And it is not only severe violence that Asian Americans in New York have had to fear, there's also been a barrage of verbal attacks and discrimination against the community. New Yorkers have had racially derogatory remarks written onto the outside of their restaurants and had flyers posted around New York City neighborhoods blaming Asian Americans for the virus. Many of these attacks go unreported, and official statistics represent only a fraction of hate crimes or hate incidents. These examples are certainly not exhaustive, and the harassment, abuse, and violence extend to communities across the country. We have witnessed Asian Americans bloodied and beaten in stores, learned that Asian American parents fear sending their children back to schools because of racial violence, and observed harrowing videos of verbal attacks aimed at Asian Americans in our public spaces. And perhaps even more heartbreaking, we have seen our Asian American frontline workers battle not only the pandemic, but also racism and disproportionately high death rates. It's important to recognize that this surge did not spontaneously rise only out of fears regarding the coronavirus pandemic. Some of this blame lies squarely on political leaders who have demonized China, both because of the virus and ongoing geopolitical tensions, and in turn, Asian Americans have fallen in harm's way. Words have power. What we say matters. How we treat each other matters. The expectations and standards we set in how we address this pandemic matter. The conversation we are having today is long overdue, and it is vital that Congress shine a light on this issue. Excuse me. The last congressional hearing held on violence against Asian Americans was in 1987 in this subcommittee. 34 years is too long for Congress to leave this issue untouched. Our government must thoroughly investigate and swiftly address growing tensions and violence against the Asian American community, especially in light of the pandemic, because lives and livelihoods are truly at stake. Last week, we reached the one-year anniversary of the COVID-19 pandemic in this country, a solemn and difficult moment for our nation as we reflected on all we have suffered and lost. But such hardship cannot be used as an excuse for dismissing the pain of our fellow Americans, enabling discrimination against them, or devaluing their sense of belonging and citizenship. Today, we are privileged to have our fellow members of Congress from both sides of the aisle testifying about their personal experiences. In addition, we have an expert panel that will walk us through the rise in discrimination and violence and its impact on the community, as well as historical perspectives and challenges to inform our legislative efforts moving forward. I look forward to hearing how we can better ensure protection, justice, and healing for our Asian American neighbors in this time of crisis and moving forward. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. We welcome our witnesses, thank them for participating in today's hearing. I will now introduce each of the witnesses, and after each introduction, we'll recognize that witness for his or her oral testimony. Please note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask you to summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that 5 minutes while you're testifying, there's a timing light on your table, but of course we don't have a table. Is there a process on the screen?
Okay, yeah.
So on the screen, they can see if it's green, you're good. If it's yellow, you're in the last minute. And if it's red, finish it. It means your 5 minutes are up. And that's on your WebEx view. Before proceeding with the testimony, I'd like to remind all the witnesses appearing on the panel that you have a legal obligation to provide truthful testimony and answers. Any false statements you make today could subject you to prosecution under Section 1001 of Title 18 of the United States Code. Today we have 2 witness panels. Our first panel will be members. Our first witness is Representative Doris Matsui. Congressman Matsui represents the 6th Congressional District of California and has represented that area of Sacramento and environs since 2005. Congressman Matsui, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Apparently, Congressman Matsui, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Apparently, there's a technical problem with WebEx and not with my iPad. We're going to recess for as much time as it's necessary to correct this error. Technology is not perfect.
Doris, can you hear me?
I can hear you and I can hear Doris as well, but they went blank there from the committee. I'm trying to figure it out right now.
Can you hear?
Yeah, because like all of a sudden I can't hear anything.
Can you hear me?
I know. They went blank and then they
guess
went
we're
silent. So I've sent messages to the
We're working on
the
the
committee.
tech issues.
I'm experiencing the same thing.
Okay.
We can hear you.
I will mute myself again then.
We can hear you. If you can hear us, wave your arms. They can't hear us. Does anybody hear me? Does anybody care? This is the Chicago Transit Authority. Hello? Hello? Jamie, do you hear me? Good work, team. Jamie Raskin, Doris Matsui, Abraham Lincoln,
Thanks for waiting. We've let the host know that you're here.
Amy Rutkin,
Testing. I'm gonna guess they can't hear us still. Testing. Nod your heads or wave if you can hear me. Awesome.
The hearing will now come back to order. Now being in order, I recognize the distinguished lady from Sacramento, California, the Honorable Doris Matsui, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee for this opportunity to testify. I'm very proud to join this distinguished panel of our colleagues, and yet I wish it were not necessary for us to be here under such troubling circumstances to address the disturbing spike in discrimination and violence against AAPI communities across the nation. Just a couple of days ago, 8 people, 6 of whom were women of Asian descent, were shot and killed outside of Atlanta. This latest attack stands as a horrible reminder of the fear and pain felt by the AAPI community across this country. I've lived an American story. I grew up on a farm in California, went to UC Berkeley, got a great public education. I got married, settled in Sacramento with my husband. We raised our son, and I had the privilege to work in public service in the White House and here in Congress, where we work together on issues of healthcare and clean energy and all the issues that really do define us as a country. But I have a responsibility and a moral obligation to speak out about the normalizing of attacks on the AAPI community. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've heard constant hostile rhetoric directed at the AAPI community, including from leaders at the highest levels of our government. There is a systemic problem here, and we are duty-bound to stop the spread of xenophobic and racist ideas that have escalated to physical threats. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who fought against discrimination in a remarkable life, used to talk about her mother and ask questions what the difference was between a bookkeeper in Brooklyn's Garment District and a Supreme Court justice. Her answer: 1 generation. This kind of family history is essential to understanding American history. We all share the charge to ensure that our country not only learns from, but does not forget its past. Because of my history and background, I know I have a duty to speak up. Future generations are listening, especially my grandchildren. In 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, approving the removal of American citizens of Japanese descent to remote camps. My parents and grandparents were among 120,000 forced to leave their homes and businesses. They were sent by their own government, our government, to a camp in Poston, Arizona. They lived in appalling conditions, surrounded by a barbed wire fence, armed guards on towers, incarcerated solely because of their ancestry. Despite the good fortune in my life, I am not even 1 generation removed from that experience. I was born in the Poston internment camp, but because I was a baby, I have no personal memories. And my parents rarely talked to me about their time there. I had an ordinary childhood. I think my parents didn't want to burden me with that experience. They just wanted me to move forward and reach for the stars. I would hear conversations from time to time about life in the camp. I sort of knew what happened, but I did not realize at that time how much their lives had been turned upside down. It's when I went to college that I met students whose parents were very affected by the internment, and we started talking. The vast majority of the people who were sent to camp were American citizens. And you wonder, how did this happen? It was then that we all realized that we had to learn more about it. It is part of our family history. It is part of American history. During World War II, many were blinded by prejudice. Our government and many of its leaders advanced the myth that the Japanese American community was inherently the enemy. Americans across the country believed it, acceded to institutionalized racism, and acted on it. It was not uncommon to accuse an innocent person of violating our country's trust with no evidence. This societal trust shift to accept and normalize wrongdoing was exactly what kept Japanese Americans in prison for over 3 years. These were Americans who previously lived normal lives. They owned homes, shops, farmers, doctors, lawyers, teachers, just regular folks who were betrayed by their country because of a dangerous spiral of injustice. Last year, when I heard at the highest levels of government, those people used racist slurs like China virus to spread xenophobia and cast blame on innocent communities. It was all too familiar. Comments like these only build upon the legacy of racism, anti-Asian sentiment, and insensitivity that seeks to divide our nation. So yes, I was deeply shaken by the angry currents in our nation. The heated discourse at the highest levels of our government cannot be viewed in isolation from the ensuing violence in our communities. The fear of the other, whether racial, religious, or tribal, that works to suppress the better angels of our nature. We've seen the consequences when we go down this path. My family has lived through these consequences. This is what we are working to root out from the deepest place in our social conscience. After the incarceration of the Japanese American community, our country moved on for decades without coming to terms with what our government did and what many Americans turned a blind eye to. It took decades for testimonies to be heard in Congress. It took decades for lawmakers to hear our pain. My late husband, Bob Matsui, was first elected to Congress in 1978 and served on the Ways and Means Committee. He loved that work. But because of his parents' experience, the experience of the Japanese American community, he passionately believed that justice could not be denied, and therefore devoted an enormous amount of time and dedication to the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, by which the United States government apologized and paid token compensation to the Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated. Bob said on the floor debate on that legislation that he believed it was possible because this is a great and wonderful country. Today's hearing is another reminder that our country is capable of growth, that this legislative body will no longer sit in silence while our communities suffer racism and hatred. Now is the time to recommit to moving forward with a shared vision for our future based upon basic human dignity. Again, I thank the chairman and ranking member, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Matsui, for that history and that testimony. Our next witness is Representative Judy Chu. Congressman Chu represents the 27th Congressional District of California, which includes Pasadena Polytechnic School and the San Gabriel Valley, in that order. She's been a member of Congress since 2009. Among other things, she's chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. Congressman Chu, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Congressman Chu, if you need to unmute. Unmute.
Thank you so much.
We hear you.
Thank you, Chairman Adler, Ranking Member Jordan, Subcommittee Chairman Cohen, Ranking Member Johnson, and other distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity to testify before you today. It is with a heavy heart that we are here today, still shocked and heartbroken about the murder of 8 in Georgia, including 6 Asian American women by a gunman who targeted 3 Asian businesses, the first one being Young's Asian Massage, then driving 27 miles to 2 other Asian spas. His targets were no accident, and what we know is that this day was coming. And because of crimes like this, I, as chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or CAPAC, urge the committee to undertake this hearing because the Asian American community has reached a crisis point that cannot be ignored. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, Asian Americans have been terrified by the alarming surge in anti-Asian bigotry and violence we have witnessed across our nation. In fact, it was over 1 year ago that CAPAC first began to sound the alarm bells about the anti-Asian discrimination we were beginning to see due to misinformation and stigma that wrongly associated Asian Americans with the coronavirus. But what started out last January as dirty looks and verbal assaults has escalated to physical attacks and violence against innocent Asian Americans. And these attacks have increasingly become more deadly. Just as many Asian Americans were preparing for the Lunar New Year last month, we saw a surge in anti-Asian violence. Many of the victims have been older and vulnerable, like Visha Ratanapakdi, an 84-year-old Thai man in San Francisco, who was killed in an unprovoked assault while on his morning walk. In New York, 61-year-old Noel Quintana's face was slashed from ear to ear with a box cutter in the subway, requiring 100 stitches. In Oakland's Chinatown, a camera captured a 91-year-old man being thrown to the ground by an assailant. In my own congressional district, a Chinese-American man was attacked at a bus stop in Rosemead with his own cane, causing him to lose part of his finger. This has become almost a daily tragedy and has had a chilling effect on our community. Today, we find that there have been nearly 3,800 anti-Asian hate crimes and incidents in just the year alone. They were stoked by the words of former President Donald Trump, who sought to shift blame and anger away from his own flawed response to the coronavirus. He used racial slurs like Wuhan virus, China plague, and Kung flu, despite the fact that the CDC and the World Health Organization warned not to associate the virus with a specific ethnicity, country, or geographic region due to the stigma it causes. Immediately, we in KPAC took Donald Trump on about this racist terminology. We issued statements, held press conferences, and sent letters. But our pleas and the guidance from experts were ignored. Instead, he doubled down on using these slurs, directing more hate and blame at the Asian American community. Over the past year, hostile anti-Asian COVID comments on Twitter increased by 900%, and we saw a nearly 150% surge in anti-Asian hate crimes in major US cities. And even though Donald Trump is no longer president, I believe the most recent round of anti-Asian attacks are the aftermath of 1 year of hateful attacks and 4 years of ugly comments about immigrants and people of color. That's why I'm so grateful that we have a new president, Joe Biden, who is working to stop these attacks, not incite them. Within his first week in President Biden issued a presidential memorandum to combat and condemn xenophobia against APIs and ensure that the Department of Justice works with our community to address these surging hate crimes. But Congress must do its part as well. That's why KPAC pushed for legislation such as Congresswoman Grace Meng's resolution to condemn anti-Asian sentiment related to COVID-19, which passed the House last fall. And that's why it's important to pass critical legislation like Congressmember Byers' No Hate Act and Congresswoman Meng's COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act that will help us to better track and respond to hate crimes and incidents against Asian Americans. We're calling for a national day to speak out against Asian hate on March 26th. It is time that we continue to push back against xenophobia every time it rears its ugly head. Asian Americans must not be used as scapegoats in times of crisis. Lives are at stake, and it's critical that Congress takes bold action to address this pandemic of discrimination and hate. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Chu. And I remember the smog in the San Gabriel Valley. Our next witness is Senator Tammy Duckworth, and after her, we'll hear from Representative Young Kim. Senator Duckworth represents the state of Illinois in the United States Senate, first elected in 2016. She previously served in the United States House of Representatives, and she represented the 8th Congressional District of Illinois for 2 terms. She has an outstanding communications team and an outstanding record in Congress. Senator Duckworth, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it was a pleasure to serve alongside you previously in the House. It's good to see you up on the dais today. Thank you for this hearing. In New York, as we've heard, an 89-year-old was slapped, and in California, a 91-year-old was pushed to the ground in the middle of a park a little girl was shoved off her bike, and in the middle of a city sidewalk, a little boy watched as his father was beaten up. Families have had rocks thrown at them, nurses have been spit on, heroes, frontline workers, hospital staff have been blamed for COVID-19, and they've been denied service, treated as other than, as less than, simply because they are members of the AAPI community. And now, less than 48 hours ago, 6 members of the Asian American community were murdered in Atlanta, Georgia. Another unspeakable tragedy after a year of unfathomable cruelty. There's nothing we can say today that will piece back together the shattered lives of the victims' loved ones. There's nothing we can do that will give them the solace they deserve, nothing we can provide that will even begin to make sense of this senseless tragedy. But what we can say, and should say clearly, unambiguously, is that blaming the AAPI community for a public health crisis is racist and wrong. And continuing to treat our fellow Americans as others only further divides our country at a time when we should be pushing, pulling, tugging at our nation with all our might until it lives up to its founding ideals of equality and justice for all. Unfortunately, this type of prejudice is far from new. It's a similar brand of discrimination to the one that marred some of our country's darkest days and toughest fights, from segregation to immigration. As Congressman Matsui has mentioned, it's in a similar vein to what was witnessed in World War II, as our nation incarcerated Japanese Americans because of their heritage and trapped thousands of families like Congresswoman Matsui's, even as their loved ones sacrificed everything on the war front to defend our nation overseas. Fortunately, the United States government recognized that this type of bigotry was un-American. Yet, the risk of repeating past grave errors is real and chilling. That's why I introduced the Korematsu Takai Civil Liberties Protection Act, which would be a first step towards safeguarding freedom and establishing a clear statutory prohibition against un-American policies that seek to imprison or otherwise detain American citizens on the basis of who they are rather than what they have done. And as the daughter of an American Vietnam veteran and an immigrant with Chinese Thai heritage, I am deeply committed to supporting our community's fight against discrimination. I applaud the efforts of this subcommittee to raise awareness of this crisis and to discuss a plan to advance civil rights for Asian Americans and protect the well-being of all of our families. You know, the American story as we know it would not exist without the strength of the AAPI community. Quite literally, Asian Americans helped build this country. With their bare hands and bent backs, they laid the railroad tracks that connected us from coast to coast. They tilled the fields and started the businesses that also picked up the rifles necessary to develop and defend this nation that we all love. And today, even as we face so much bigotry and violence, our community is helping to keep the country running. So I just want to take a minute to thank all the incredible, heroic frontline workers who are getting our nation through this crisis. From the doctors and the nurses risking their own lives to try to save the lives of strangers, to the cashier at the market who's helping our families stay fed, from janitors sweeping up hospital rooms at night to the teachers patiently helping our kids learn their ABCs over Zoom. I hope you know that we see you and we see your sacrifices and that we are forever in your debt. We'll never be able to fully express our gratitude for all of the APIs on the front lines, but every hour of every day, I'm going to keep trying because that's the least that these folks deserve. So I want to say thank you one more time for everything that they do. And going forward, I hope that all Americans will speak up against such hatred towards their neighbors. And I look forward to continuing to work with President Biden's executive order that assists states and community organizations make this kind of discrimination a thing of the past. Please know that we have so much work ahead of us, and I thank this committee for holding this hearing to shed a light on this very, very serious issue that will divide our nation and make us weaker, not stronger. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. It's nice to see you and have you back in the House again. Now we'd like to recognize a new member of the House, Representative Young Kim. Representative Kim represents the 39th Congressional District of California, which includes the northern parts of Orange County. Not sure if she's got the big A in Anaheim, the ballpark, or the Disney World, or the Knott's Berry Farm, or those places, but they're all out there. First elected in 2020. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, and the members of the committee for holding this hearing today on a very important topic that has been prevalent in our national conversation, but one that is very, very personal to me as an Asian American. I represent California's 39th Congressional District. This is one of the most diverse districts in the country, and it's also a home to a vibrant Asian American community. My district is truly a representation of America and what makes our country great. Asian Americans have and continue to make countless contributions to communities across the country and right here in the halls of Congress. Since the beginning of COVID-19, we have increasingly seen Asian Americans becoming targets of hate across the nation, with more than 3,000 hate crimes against the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. Those crimes have been reported nationwide, with an increased number of attacks against seniors. This week, we saw senseless violence in Atlanta that took the lives of 6 Asian American women. While the investigation is ongoing and we wait for more information, this comes during a time when violence and attacks against Asian Americans are on the rise. The hate, the bias, and the attacks that we've seen against the Asian American community are unacceptable, and they must be stopped. This is wrong, and it has no place in our political discourse, and it's contrary to the values that America stands for. This should not have to be said, but I want to be very clear. No American of any race or ethnic group is responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic. The virus does not discriminate. It affects everyone. We must come together as Americans, not just to fight COVID-19, but also to stand against the rise of hate and discrimination against the AAPI community and any other group of Americans. We also cannot forget that discrimination we've seen against the AAPI community is not limited to the violence and attacks. I hope we can look at the nation's elite universities and other institutions of learning. We have seen institutions discriminating against Asian Americans in their admissions process in order to deny them the entry. Discrimination is wrong and goes against our fundamental American values that we hold dear. In America, we value the individual, and we believe that people deserve to be judged on their merits and not penalized because of their heritage, race, or background. These are the values that my family and countless of immigrants came here for. When our country seems more divided than ever, we should work together to unify our country and ensure future generations of Americans, regardless of their background, have the same opportunity to access the promise of America. No matter our race or background, we are all Americans. Asian Americans are Americans. As an Asian American and a member of Congress, I feel a duty to speak out. So I stand with the AAPI community today and always. So I want to thank you for allowing me to speak on this very, very important issue. And I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Kim. Our next witness is Representative Michelle Park Steele. Congressman Steele represents the 48th Congressional District in California, which includes other portions of Orange County. She was first elected in 2020. Congressman Steele, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Steve Cohen and Ranking Member Chip Roy, thank you for holding this important conversation today. It has been heartbreaking to see the rise in anti-Asian American hate and harassment over the last year. As we will hear today from our witnesses, and we've been hearing from our witnesses, hate against the Asian American community is not new. According to Sean Wu, a former federal prosecutor, violence against Asian Americans have been under-scrutinized, under-prosecuted, and often condoned. This is a long, sad history of intolerance and hate directed at our community. And in the last year, almost 4,000 incidents of verbal harassment, physical assault, and discrimination have been reported. California is at the top of the list with 44% of all incidents reported happening in my home state. New York is second on the list, making up 13% of all the incidents reported. 68% of these incidents and crimes were targeted towards Asian American women. This has to stop. When I was chair of the Orange County Board of Supervisors, I introduced a resolution that called for tolerance and compassion towards all residents and condemned discrimination against the AAPI community. I was proud this year to introduce a similar resolution in Congress with other Orange County Congresswoman Katie Porter. That's because combating hate is not a partisan issue. We can all agree that violence against any community should never be tolerated. As a first-generation Korean American who is now serving her community in the halls of Congress, this is my American dream. I want future generations of Americans to know they can achieve anything in this great country. That's why I also like to use some of my time today to talk about the discrimination that the AAPI community is experiencing in our nation's education system. It is one of the reasons why my colleague, Representative Kim, and I joined Ranking Member Jordan and Subcommittee Ranking Member Johnson to request the President of Yale University to testify at today's hearing. Last year, the Department of Justice filed a case alleging that Yale University was discriminating against Asian American and white applicants. But the Biden administration dropped the suit last month. This is totally wrong and sets a dangerous precedent. In 1996, I supported and campaigned for California's Proposition 209, which banned racial preferences in public hiring, education, and contracting. It was modeled after the Civil Rights Act. Before Prop 209 was passed, the four-year graduation rate for underrepresented racial minorities in the University of California system was 31.3%. By 2014, that has increased to 51.1%. The six-year graduation rate is even better, increasing from 66.5% in 1998 to 75.1% in 2013. Last year in California, Democrats introduced Proposition 16 to bring back racial preferences in hiring, contracting, and our education system. Californians overwhelmingly rejected it. As a new member of Congress and immigrant to this country, we should be encouraging all students and young people to succeed, especially in our education system. Discrimination is against the fundamental value of American culture, and that includes discrimination against the AAPI community in the halls of our schools and universities. This is wrong. This type of behavior is only hurting future generations. We should be working together to stop this discrimination and hate in its tracks, and to encourage the next generation to achieve their own American dream. I thank the committee for the opportunity to testify and share this with you today. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Steele. Thank you very much. Final witness on this first panel is the Honorable Representative Grace Ming. Congressman Ming represents the 6th Congressional District of the Empire State, New York, includes Flushing, Bayside, Fresh Meadows, and other portions of northeastern Queens. She's been in Congress since 2013. Congressman Ming, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler, Chairman Cohen, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of this committee for organizing today's hearing. The topic is discrimination and violence against Asian Americans. Some of us seem to be going a little off topic. I'm not sure why. For over a year, Asian Americans have been fighting an additional virus of hate and bigotry. Anti-Asian rhetoric like China virus, Kung flu, misinformation, racism have left Asian Americans traumatized and fearful for their lives. Mr. Roy mentioned the WHO, and it's the same World Health Organization that actually said not to use countries of origin when we're referring to diseases. Since last year, there have been over 3,800 reported incidents of anti-Asian hate. But we know that the majority of incidents go reported. And in fact, nearly 70% of reported anti-Asian hate incidents have happened to Asian American women. In fact, just this week, we saw the terrible news about the 6 Asian women who were shot and killed in the Atlanta area. Our community is bleeding. We are in pain, and for the last year, we've been screaming out for help. Asian American discrimination, however, is not new in this country. From the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act to the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans, and from the 1975 police brutality in Manhattan's Chinatown to the 1982 murder of Vincent Chin, discrimination against Asian Americans is a shameful part of our history. Unfortunately, so much of this history is not taught in our schools. Excluding Asian Americans from our history books renders us invisible and deems us the perpetual foreigner. In fact, history has excluded the history of Asian Americans, Black Americans, Latino and Native Americans, and that has led to the systemic inequities at many institutions, including our academic institutions. In the 116th Congress, I introduced my resolution to condemn anti-Asian sentiment related to COVID, and I was grateful my resolution passed the House with bipartisan support, except for 164 of our Republican colleagues who voted against it, even though some had the audacity to tweet condolences after Atlanta's tragedy. I'm glad to hear about my colleague, Representative Steele's resolution, and I hope that she has better luck getting her party to support the resolution. During this last year, it became painfully apparent that we need a comprehensive effort from our local communities to the federal level. That's why I support bills like the No Hate Act, and that's why Senator Hirono and I introduced the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which would assign a point person at the Department of Justice to quickly review hate crimes and to make it easier for people to report these incidents. My bill also builds on President Biden's presidential memorandum by directing relevant federal agencies to work with community-based organizations to find ways to talk about the virus in a way that is not racist. I urge my colleagues on this committee for swift consideration of these bills. We cannot turn a blind eye to people living in fear. I want to go back to something that Mr. Roy said earlier. Your president and your party and your colleagues can talk about issues with any other country that you want, but you don't have to do it by putting a bullseye on the back of Asian Americans across this country, on our grandparents, on our kids. This hearing was to address the hurt and pain of our community and to find solutions, and we will not let you take our voice away from us. Thank you. I yield back.
Congressman Ming, thank you very much. You're correct about the genesis of this hearing. Now we will go to our second panel. The second member panel should turn their cameras on. There we go. I think we're coming along there. First member panel can turn their cameras off. Great light show. I guess we're ready. We're going to be ready. We're now on our second panel, and our first witness is Mr. John Yang. Mr. Yang is President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the AAJC, which seeks to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans, and to build and promote a fair and equitable society for all through policy, advocacy, education, and litigation. He received a JD from George Washington University School of Law and his BA from Washington University in St. Louis. Mr. Yang, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chairman Cohen. Thank you to the Ranking Member Johnson, and the other members of the committee. Really appreciate the opportunity to testify before all of you today. And I really appreciate the powerful words from Representative Mang and the other KPEC members as to why we are here today. When I agreed to testify at this hearing, no one could have imagined that this would come 2 days after the horrific shooting in Atlanta, Georgia. And so I also want to take a moment to recognize and honor the victims and their families and the suffering that they are going through at this moment. And to remember that we must center ourselves in the Atlanta community and all of the local communities that have been affected during this past year with respect to the anti-Asian violence. Look, for a year now, Asian Americans have been fighting 2 viruses, the COVID-19 pandemic affecting all of us, as well as this virus of racism. Asian Americans, like all Americans, have suffered the economic and health consequences of COVID-19. But at the same time, Asian Americans have been at the front lines as essential workers in grocery stores, in delivery trucks, in custodial services, as well as in health professions. Unfortunately, Asian Americans have also been fighting the second virus, this virus of racism. We have long struggled for visibility and equity, and now our communities are faced with this additional physical and mental harm that is arising out of the COVID-19 pandemic. As Ms. Kulkarni will testify, web-based self-reporting tools have recorded a tremendous increase in the number of anti-Asian hate that we have seen this past year. A Pew report from last year confirmed what that data shows, that a majority of Asian Americans say it is more common for people to blame Asians for COVID-19 and have expressed insensitive and completely inappropriate views about Asian Americans than before COVID-19. An Ipsos survey shows the same thing, where over 30% of the American population say that they have witnessed harassment or blame of the Asian community for COVID-19, and 60% of the Asian American population showed that this was similar behavior that they were seeing. So these fears are real. And the other thing is the impact on the Asian American communities is clear with respect to their businesses. As noted in a report by McKinsey and Company, misguided fears of the virus effectively shuttered businesses in many Asian American cultural districts a full month before lockdowns began nationwide. Our organization and others started talking about this issue in late January when we saw this happening. And districts during that time when we saw this happening, and to say that it was still safe to go there before the lockdowns. In New York, as demonstrated by a study by our community partner, Asian American Federation, there has been record job losses for the Asian American community. In New York, there was a 6,000% increase in unemployment benefit applications from February through June of 2020. And Asian Americans suffered the largest increase in unemployment, going from 3% in February of 2020 to over 25%. Now look, Asian American racism is rooted in 2 very dangerous stereotypes, that of the perpetual foreigner and that of the model minority. The perpetual foreigner suggests that we can be here and we can be born here and we can live here as long as we want, but we are still seen as foreigners. We are still seen as the other, not to be trusted and to be feared. On the flip side of that stereotype is the so-called model minority, to suggest that Asian Americans are held up as the good people of color when it is convenient, to plant seeds of division within allied communities of color. And here I will call out people that try to use affirmative action as a wedge to drive between Asian Americans and other communities of color. That model minority myth hides the complexities of our community and the economic disparities that exist among Asian Americans. Even as the COVID-19 pandemic recedes, we must remember that anti-Asian racism is likely to continue. We do have legitimate concerns and geopolitical differences with the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party, but that is likely to remain for the foreseeable future. But if we are not careful, those differences will have consequences on our Asian American community, and we can expect a backlash against our community. We've seen that happen with the Japanese American community in World War II. We've seen that happen with the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian American community after 9/11, and we saw that happen with the murder of Vincent Chin in 1982. We have to do better than that. We have to have the proper nuance to call out xenophobia, racism, whenever it occurs against our community. And we must call out to stop this cycle of violence. It is only then that we will stop seeing Asian Americans as this perpetual foreigner to be feared and come up to a better place in addressing this racism. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. Our next witness is Manju Shah Kulkarni. She's Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, a coalition of over 40 community-based organizations that serve and represent the 1.5 million Asian American and Pacific Islanders in Los Angeles County. She's also a co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, an online self-reporting and tracking tool launched on March 19, 2020 in response to a sharp rise in anti-Asian xenophobia and bigotry resulting from the references to the COVID-19 pandemic's provenance. She received her JD from Boston University School of Law and her BA from Duke University. Ms. Kulkarni, you are now recognized for 5 minutes. Ms. Kulkarni, did you hear me? You're recognized for 5 minutes. You may need to unmute. Did we lose sound again? Can anybody hear me? Amy, this isn't my fault. We will have a 5-minute recess and we'll be back.
Thanks for waiting. We've let the host know that you're here.
Testing. Testing.
This is John Yang. I can hear you.
Great, we're back, we're back. Recess is over. No more milk and cookies. Ms. Kulkarni, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Unmute. Unmute.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member, and distinguished members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify before you today. Go back to Wuhan and take the virus with you. You are the reason for the coronavirus. Damn, another Asian riding with me. Hope you don't have COVID. These are but a few examples of what Asian Americans have experienced over the course of the last year, alongside with refusal of service, workplace discrimination, and sadly now homicide. For that reason, on March 19, 2020, my organization, Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, in conjunction with Chinese for Affirmative Action and San Francisco State University's Asian American Studies Department, launched Stop AAPI Hate. In the past 11 months, we have received almost 3,800 self-reported incidents of bias and discrimination from all 50 states and the District of Columbia, making Stop AAPI Hate the nation's leading aggregator of Asian American hate. From our analysis, the following trends have emerged. 68% of incidents involve verbal harassment, 20% involve avoidance or shunning, 11% physical assaults, and 9% civil rights violations, including refusal of service, vandalism, workplace discrimination, and discrimination in housing. The vast majority do not involve a hate crime. Businesses, including grocery stores, pharmacies, and big box retail, are the primary site of discrimination. This is followed by public streets and public parks. The fact that so many incidents take place at businesses is especially concerning, given that retail venues sell goods necessary for daily living, essential during a pandemic. Given that 35% of incidents occur in public spaces is also worrisome. These figures give credence to the anxiety felt by APIs that purchasing food, refilling prescriptions, or simply going on a walk might leave them vulnerable to being attacked. Our data indicates that especially vulnerable populations, including women, youth, and seniors, have reported experiencing anti-Asian hate incidents at significant rates. As has been noted, 68% of incident reports come from women. This is perhaps to be expected given the lessons learned from the Me Too movement and a survey of Stop Street Harassment, which found that 81% of women experience street harassment in their daily lives. While Chinese Americans have often been the explicit target of perpetrators, they make up only 42% of individuals who reported to our site. 15% identify as Korean Americans, 9% as Vietnamese, and 8% as Filipino American. We have also received reports from South Asian Americans as well as Pacific Islanders and others, evidencing the fact that Asian Americans across ethnicities are experiencing hate and racism today with our Pacific Islander sisters and brothers. Sadly, the 3,800 reported to Stop AAPI Hate represent only a fraction of what has happened in this country. The widespread nature of anti-Asian hate is confirmed by a study by the Pew Research Center released last July that found that 3 in 10 Asian Americans experience racist jokes and slurs. Similarly, a poll by the Center for Public Integrity found that 60% of Asian Americans have witnessed someone blaming our community for COVID-19. Before I close, I want to acknowledge the tremendous mobilization done by Asian American groups in Georgia in response to the violence there and read a portion of their statement. During this time of broader crisis and trauma in our Asian American communities, we must be guided by a compass of community care that prioritizes assessing and addressing our community's immediate needs, including in-language support for mental health, legal, employment, and immigration services. We must stand firm in decrying misogyny, systemic violence, and white supremacy. In addition to sharing our data and the statement from Georgia advocates, I want to share the fact that we have been developing resources for community members who experience incidents of hate and providing direct assistance through local networks. We are also closely working with local, state, and federal policymakers to address the hate incidents that have occurred and seek to prevent additional incidents from taking place in the future. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to taking any questions.
Thank you very much, and you were perfect on the 5 minutes. Our next witness is Erica Lee. She's a Regents Professor of History and Asian American Studies and the Director of the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota. She's the author of 4 award-winning books, including America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States, which won the 2020 American Book Award and the 2020 Asian Pacific American Award for Literature. Professor Lee received her MA and PhD in History from the University of California, Berkeley, and her BA from Tufts University. Professor Lee, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Cohen and members of the committee. I'm so honored to join you. I also want to thank all of the congressional staffers who have helped to make this hearing possible. As we've just heard from my fellow witnesses, anti-Asian racism and violence has risen alarmingly. As shocking as these incidents are, it is so vital to understand that they are not random acts perpetrated by deranged individuals. They are an expression of our country's long history of systemic racism targeting Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We've heard in the past 24 hours many describe anti-Asian discrimination and racial violence as un-American. Unfortunately, it is very American. This history, this American history, is over 150 years old. Let me share just a few examples. In 1871, 17 Chinese were lynched by a mob of 500 in Los Angeles. This was the largest mass lynching in US history. In 1886, a mob of 1,500 forced out all of Seattle's Chinese residents. In the early 20th century, South Asians were expelled from cities, and Filipino Americans and Japanese Americans were attacked. Most recently, in 1982, Vincent Chin, a Chinese American, was beaten to death in Detroit because his attackers thought he was Japanese and blamed him for the economic decline in the auto industry. Throughout the 1980s, attacks on Korean shopkeepers and Southeast Asian refugees were widespread. After 9/11, hate crimes targeting Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian Americans increased by 1,600%. As these incidents reveal, Asian Americans have been terrorized. We've been treated as enemies. We've been discriminated against. Today, we are still viewed as foreigners rather than US citizens. The government of this country has not just ignored this problem, it has been part of the problem. Throughout much of our history, Congress and other elected officials have promoted and legalized anti-Asian racism through its laws and its actions. In 1875, Congress passed the so-called Page Act, which effectively barred the entry of Chinese women because lawmakers believed that all Chinese women were prostitutes. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first federal law singling out an entire group for immigration exclusion based on race. By the 1930s, all other Asian groups, Japanese, Koreans, South Asians, and Filipinos, were also barred from the US and prevented from becoming naturalized citizens. Asian immigration did not fully open up again until 1965. In 1942, President Roosevelt signed an executive order that allowed for the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans as prisoners without trial. And I want to thank Representative Matsui so much for sharing her own family's history so that we never forget the real consequences of racism. For many years after 9/11, not just right after the terrorist attacks, but for many years after, South Asian Americans faced systemic racism in the form of profiling by government agencies. During this past year, some of our highest elected officials deliberately and consistently used racist language tying COVID-19 to Asians. This included the phrases that we've been talking about this morning, Chinese virus, Wuhan virus, and also telling Americans to quote unquote blame China for the pandemic. These words matter, especially when they repeatedly came from the White House during the previous administration. Researchers have found that the anti-Asian rhetoric promoted by leaders directly correlated with a rise in racist incidents against Asian Americans. This history of racism is not taught in our schools. Instead, many Americans believe the deceptive model minority stereotype, portraying Asian Americans only as success stories. Proving that AAPIs do indeed experience structural racism and institutionalized discrimination remains a persistent challenge. The last time, and seemingly the only other time in our country's history that Congress has held hearings on anti-Asian racism was 34 years ago before this committee. Over 20 million in number, Asian Americans are now the fastest growing racial group in the United States. We are your constituents. but we are in crisis from the multiple and disproportionate effects of the pandemic on our diverse AAPI communities. U.S. citizens are being told to go back to their own countries. Nurses and doctors on the front lines are subjected to racist tirades. As we've seen in Atlanta, Asian-owned businesses and workers are being attacked, and all of this violence especially targets women. Like all Americans, AAPIs are struggling with the public health crisis and the shuttered economy. That we also have to worry about being attacked or harassed in our own neighborhoods makes our pandemic experience even more difficult. Congress needs to act definitively and immediately to address the enduring problem of anti-Asian racism in the U.S. The acts facing AAPIs today are a systemic national tragedy. They will not simply go away after the pandemic. We call upon our leaders to condemn racism in all of its forms, invest in AAPI communities, and support individuals who have experienced race-based violence. We cannot afford to wait another 34 years for Congress to act. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Our next witness is Charles Lehman. Mr. Lehman is a fellow with the Manhattan Institute, working primarily on the Policing and Public Safety Initiative. He is also contributing editor of City Journal. Mr. Lehman receives his BA from Yale University. Mr. Lehman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you to the committee for the invitation to speak today about the important issue of rising crime against Asian Americans. Many of our fellow citizens now fear for their safety in their own neighborhoods. I am glad this matter has not escaped Congress's attention, particularly in light of Tuesday's awful shooting outside of Atlanta. I am speaking today as a researcher focused on crime, and it is in that capacity that I want to offer 2 points. The first is that, while some of these offenses were doubtless motivated by bias, you should be cautious when interpreting the broader trend solely as a spike in hate crimes. The second, relatedly, is that these crimes should be understood as part of a larger surge in violence. As you're aware, crime is rising in several Asian American communities, particularly in the Greater Bay Area and New York City. There have been reports of assaults, daylight robberies, and general mayhem targeting Asian citizens, especially the elderly. Many have identified these offenses as hate crimes, linking them to bigoted sentiments inspired by the coronavirus pandemic. The FBI, which tracks such offenses, defines a hate crime as one motivated by an offender's, quote, bias against a race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. Last spring saw a spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans as major cities experienced a 150% increase over 2019. This was doubtless driven by rhetoric blaming Asians for the coronavirus crisis. In the latest wave, some offenses are plainly bias motivated, like the attack in Seattle, which assailant Samuel Green told Kathy Yeager, quote, Asians need to be put in your place, as he shoved her to the ground. But not all of the recent cases are so clear-cut. The reason for Tuesday's horrific shootings in Atlanta remains unclear, but police suspect it was not racially motivated. Law enforcement in both New York and Northern California are reportedly not investigating many of the high-profile offenses as hate crimes. Other factors are likely at play. Consider Yahya Muslim, arrested for shoving 3 Asian adults, including a 91-year-old, in Oakland's Chinatown. Muslim, who is homeless, has a history of mental illness, which his defense counsel blames for the attack. Counsel for Antoine Watson, who allegedly shoved and killed 84-year-old Lucha Ratanapakdi in San Francisco, has also appealed to the teenager's mental health, rejecting charges of bias. Other cases start to look different given context. Filipino New Yorker Noel Quintana was a victim of a subway knife attack that some have called racially motivated. But several other non-Asian victims have also recently been slashed on the MTA, part of rising transit crime, which swept up Quintana. My purpose in making these points is not to deny the role bias has played in some offenses, or to downplay the seriousness of anti-Asian bigotry. I want to condemn, in no uncertain terms, hate crimes of all sorts. They are a particularly vicious species of offense, motivated by special animus and deserving of special denunciation. No American should have to face discrimination of any kind. Rather, I wish to emphasize to the committee that if they analyze these offenses solely as hate crimes, they will miss critical context and thereby risk making underinformed decisions. In particular, we cannot discuss these offenses without highlighting the past year's violent crime wave. Criminologist Jeff Asher has estimated that 2020 saw the largest one-year spike in homicides on record, as murder increased by more than 30% in nearly 40 major cities. New data indicate the trend has persisted into early 2021. That pattern appears in cities where Asian residents are being attacked. In San Francisco, homicide was up 17%. In New York, homicides rose 40%, while shootings nearly doubled. In Oakland, 2020 saw the highest homicide rate in 8 years, and the city's on track for a worse 2021. With 157 dead, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution called 2020 the city's deadliest year in decades. That violence is a product of free-roaming criminals. Carl Chan, head of Oakland's Chinatown Chamber of Commerce, describes how, quote, businesses are so fearful they prefer to close early. We also have many juveniles driving around Chinatown and carrying guns, so they're also hurting people before they're being robbed. This is a description not of hate crimes, but of out-and-out lawlessness. This behavior seems obviously tied to recent political hostility to the police. Many cities have yielded to activist demands that they slash police budgets and cut public safety services. Bigotry may have played a role in these offenses, but changing the hearts and minds of bigots is far harder from a policymaker's perspective than preventing bigotry-driven crimes. If anything is to blame for the terror now plaguing Asian Americans, it is public officials' dereliction of their duty to preserve public safety. I urge the members of the committee to advocate a restoration of public safety by pushing back on anti-police rhetoric and by supporting more federal funding for police. This is the best way to ensure that Asian Americans and all Americans can again walk the streets free from the fear of violent crime. Thank you, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lehman. Our next witness is with us here in person. That's a nice exception. Nice for you to be here. Mr. Winkong Fa. Mr. Fa is an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation, litigating cases focused on free speech and equality before the law. He receives his JD from the University of Michigan, not in the NCAA tournament, I think. Maybe they are, I don't know. And a master's, they are in the tournament, aren't they? Yeah, and a master's degree in political philosophy from the London School of Economics and a BA from the University of Texas, Dallas. Mr. Fa, you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Chairman, Ranking Member, thank you for inviting me to testify today. Before I begin, I want to say that I'm saddened by the violence committed in Georgia on Tuesday. I express my heartfelt condolences to the families of the victims. I never could have imagined being here today when I boarded a flight from Beijing to San Francisco 25 years ago. I knew 2 words of English when I got to America: banana, which I likely learned on the plane, and goodbye, which my grandmother taught me in Beijing as she dropped me off at the bus stop every Sunday. Since then, I became the first person in my family to receive a law degree, and I won the first case I litigated before the Supreme Court in June 2018. A few hours after I got the decision in the Supreme Court case, I went to take a citizenship test in front of an immigration officer, and I laughed when he asked me how many justices there were on the Supreme Court. I have since become a proud citizen of the United States. I am here today to say that racial discrimination is wrong, but when it comes to Asian Americans in education, far too many in our government condone discrimination. This is something I've experienced firsthand as an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation, where my colleagues and I represent Asian American families who have felt the sting of government-sanctioned discrimination. These families seek to vindicate the principle of equality before the law, which requires government to treat people as individuals and forbids government from treating us differently on the basis of government-sanctioned stereotypes. Last week, Pacific Legal Foundation filed a case challenging Fairfax County's discriminatory changes to its admissions policy for Thomas Jefferson High School, or TJ as it is more commonly known. We represent a coalition of parents, including Dr. Chen, a Chinese immigrant who is now a chemistry professor. His eldest daughter attends TJ, but her younger sister might not get that chance. That's because the county replaced an objective test with a so-called holistic process designed to racially balance the student body at the expense of Asian American students. The changes at TJ were made against the backdrop of unfounded racial stereotypes. One school board member referred to the culture at TJ as toxic. A Virginia state delegate accused Asian Americans of being dishonest in getting their children admitted, and made the baseless claim that the parents had no intention of staying in America. We're pursuing a similar case in Montgomery County, where efforts to racially balance the magnet middle schools have drastically reduced the number of Asian American students. In yet another case, I represent Asian American families in New York. My clients include Asian American immigrants who want the opportunity for their children to earn their way into public schools like Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, and Brooklyn Tech. But Mayor de Blasio stated that the majority Asian compositions of those schools was a, quote, monumental injustice, and changed the admissions policy to make it harder for low-income Asian American students to get into those schools. Pacific Legal Foundation has also filed a friend of the court brief in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, a case using Harvard's explicit use of race in a way that decreases Asian American enrollment. This too has led to pernicious stereotypes, including college guidebooks telling Asian American students to refrain from saying that they aspire to pursue a career in medicine or major in math or science. Apparently, those interests are too Asian. This is America. Government should not condone discrimination, and it must not actively engage in it. The subcommittee should continue to explore ways in which official government policy has discriminated against Asian Americans and continue to work with Pacific Legal Foundation and others to end this racial discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you for appearing in person, and thank you for keeping your mask up. That's appreciated by all on the committee. Our next witness is Mr. Daniel Day Kim. Mr. Kim is an actor and producer. He's best known for his role as Jin-Soo Kwon on the TV series Lost, for which he shared a 2006 Screen Actors Guild Award for Best Ensemble. He also portrayed Chin-Ho Kelly on the series Hawaii Five-0 for 7 seasons. Last month, together with actor Daniel Wu, he offered a $25,000 reward for information regarding a January 31 assault of a 91-year-old man in Oakland's Chinatown, following 2 similar incidents targeting elderly Asian residents. Mr. Kim received a Master of Fine Arts degree from New York University and his undergraduate degree from Haverford College. Mr. Kim, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cohen and Ranking Member Roy and the members of the Judiciary Committee. I'm both honored and dismayed to be back in front of you again. Some of you may remember that I was with you just this past September discussing the importance of diversity in American media. You may recall that the reason I was moved to speak then was because the House had just recently passed H.R. 908, condemning all forms of anti-hate Asian sentiment. But I was disheartened to find that for a bill that required no money or resources, just a simple condemnation of acts of hate against people of Asian descent, 164 members of Congress, all Republican, voted against it. And now here I am again, because as every witness in this hearing has pointed out, the situation has gotten worse, much worse. Vicha Ratanapakdi, murdered. Pak Ho, murdered. Noel Quintana, face slashed with a blade from ear to ear. An 89-year-old woman set on fire. Tadataka Ono, a professional jazz pianist, beaten so badly he can no longer play piano. And now 7 Asian people shot dead in Georgia 2 days ago, 6 of whom were women. These are only a few of the 3,800 reported incidents since last March. I was speaking to a pollster during the recent elections, and I asked him why, when I see polling results broken down by race, do I so rarely see Asian Americans as a separate category? He heard my question, he looked me dead in the eye, and he said, because Asian Americans are considered statistically insignificant. Statistically insignificant. Now, all of you listening to me here by virtue of your own elections are more familiar with the intricacies of polling than I am. So undoubtedly, you already know what this means. Statistically insignificant literally means we don't matter. We as Asian Americans have come to this country because we believe in the American dream. Many of us have succeeded, and some of us are even the frontline healthcare workers upon whom we've all come to depend during this terrible pandemic. But many of us are struggling too. In fact, the wealth disparity between the richest Asian Americans and the poorest is the largest of any ethnic group in America. In New York, Asian Americans have a higher poverty rate than any other minority group, where fully 1 in 4 are living below the poverty line. And poverty rates among Asian American seniors are much higher than the national average. That's something to consider as we watch the most vulnerable in our community get taunted, pushed, slashed, and murdered. Despite this wide disparity of experiences, we continue to be tagged the model minority. We simply cannot continue to live with the myth that the most successful of us represent the totality of us. So we know the hurdles we face. The question for us here is, what can we do about them? One of the places that starts is with education. Let's teach them everything that Professor Lee so eloquently highlighted for us, including celebrating the fact that the most decorated combat unit in U.S. military history was the 442nd Combat Team, a unit in World War II made up entirely of Asian Americans. Now, these are not moments in Asian American history. This is American history. When we are erased from our history books, we are made invisible. And the result, to quote Congresswoman Meng, is that we are perpetually made to feel like foreigners in our own country. Include our stories, because they matter. We must also empower our local community organizers by directing funds to areas that have been historically impoverished, not just for the benefit of the AAPI community, but for the benefit of all communities living there, most of whom are non-white. It's no wonder that there's historically been tension among racial groups when the thing they have most in common is poverty and lack of access to services. And there happen to be two pieces of legislation before this committee as we speak that deal with these specific issues. One is the No Hate Bill. It provides necessary grants and money to community organizations, counseling for those convicted of hate crimes, and improved data collection for hate crime reporting, among other important services. The committee also has before it right now the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act introduced by Congresswoman Meng and Senator Hirono. It's crucial that we have reliable reporting for these hate crimes and an infrastructure that makes it easy for people for whom English is not their primary language. Chairman Nadler, you have been an ally to the AAPI community in the past. I respectfully urge you not to let these bills languish in committee, but see them through so that they can be passed by the full House and then on to the Senate. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that I'm going to convince all of you to stand up for us. Trust me, I've seen your voting records. But I am speaking to those to whom humanity still matters. In closing, let me just say that there are several moments in a country's history that chart its course indelibly for the future. For Asian Americans, that moment is now. What happens right now and over the course of the coming months will send a message for generations to come as to whether we matter, whether the country we call home chooses to erase us or include us, dismiss us or respect us, invisibilize us or see us. Because you may consider us statistically insignificant now, but one more fact that has no alternative is that we are the fastest growing racial demographic in the country. We are 23 million strong. We are united, and we are waking up. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Our next witness is Shirin Sinar. She's professor of law and John A. Wilson faculty scholar at Stanford Law School. Her scholarship focuses on, among other things, the role of institutions in protecting individual rights and democratic values in the national security context. Her recent work assesses the legal regime for domestic and international terrorism under U.S. law. Professor Sinar holds a JD from Stanford, a Master of Philosophy, International Relations from Cambridge University, and an MA and a BA as well from Harvard. She was a law clerk for the Honorable Warren J. Ferguson of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Professor Sinar, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for convening this important hearing and inviting me to participate. I want to begin by acknowledging the horrific mass shootings in Atlanta. Whatever the motive, those murders have traumatized Asian American communities already reeling from a year of persistent hate violence. I'd like to make 2 points today. First, while the causes of hate crimes are complex, academic research shows that hostile rhetoric from political leaders towards immigrants or racial minorities can embolden people to commit violence against them. Research also shows that political events that change perceptions of social norms, like the acceptability of racist or xenophobic views, have triggered hate violence. And specifically with respect to former President Trump, Prior studies have shown that hate crimes spiked immediately after his election and that his negative tweets towards Muslims strongly correlated with anti-Muslim hate crimes. That brings us to the past year, when former President Trump and other political leaders relentlessly characterized the coronavirus in racist terms, as recently as this week. Stop AAPI Hates research shows that Donald Trump's anti-Asian tweets were shared on social media over 1 million times. A substantial number of anti-Asian hate incidents used language similar to Trump's. Beyond rhetoric, the racial profiling of Chinese and Chinese American researchers, scientists, and students as security risks exposes Asian American communities to a higher risk of societal discrimination and violence. This is familiar from the experience of South Asian, Muslim, Sikh, and Arab American communities treated as suspects over the nearly 2-decade-long war on terror. While hostile rhetoric or discriminatory policy is certainly not the sole cause of recent anti-Asian violence, it has made Asian Americans vulnerable both to racially motivated and to opportunistic attacks. The second point I'd like to make is that while the response to hate crimes has often been to call for increased sentences, many Asian American community organizations are now advocating a broader set of strategies to address hate crimes. Horrific acts like the Atlanta shootings require a serious law enforcement response. But for several reasons, community groups are also looking for solutions beyond criminal law, especially with respect to the more common forms of hate crimes that occur. For one thing, many incidents of hate speech targeting Asian Americans do not qualify as criminal, but they still create significant harm. In addition, many victims do not report incidents to police because of mistrust of law enforcement. And concern around over-policing and mass incarceration has led many in communities of color to consider other avenues to help victims heal, hold perpetrators accountable, and prevent violence. Numerous Asian American organizations have emphasized the importance of cross-racial solidarity in response to hate crimes, rather than pitting struggling communities against one another. Many have advocated deep investments in communities to strengthen support systems, both to prevent violence and to support violence when hate crimes occur. That support can take many forms, whether it is through funding culturally competent mental health care services, reforming victim compensation programs to better support hate crimes victims, hosting conflict de-escalation training, or establishing grant programs to protect institutions at high risk of hate crimes. There is also growing interest in exploring forms of restorative justice to address hate crimes, especially with respect to young offenders and relatively less serious offenses. Restorative justice refers to processes that bring together people affected by an offense to address the harm and agree upon mechanisms to repair it. Some evidence suggests that restorative justice programs reduce recidivism and alleviate the emotional harm of survivors better than traditional criminal processes. They are not an option in every case, and much more research is necessary. But there is growing interest within communities in creative alternatives to hold people accountable, help victims recover their sense of safety, and prevent further violence. Thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts.
Thank you for sharing that. Our last witness is Hiroshi Motomura. He is Susan Westerberg Prager Distinguished Professor of Law, Faculty Co-Director, Center for Immigration of Law and Policy at UCLA. His teachings and scholarship focus on immigration and citizenship. His book, Americans in Waiting, The Lost Story of Immigration and Citizenship in the United States, won the Professional and Scholarly Publishing Award with the Association of American Publishers as the year's best book in law and legal studies. Professor Motomura received his JD from Cal Berkeley and his BA from Yale. Professor, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. My remarks take a step back from the specifics of the incidents that other witnesses have addressed. There's a natural tendency to explain away these crimes as isolated acts of a few individuals. And related is a natural tendency to avoid a deep look at why these crimes were committed, why more crimes now, and why against victims of Asian ancestry. But these crimes follow a long historical pattern, as you've heard today, and I'd like to explain a key reason for this history. Individuals commit crimes, but they do so in a society that reflects the laws under which we live. To see hate crimes as isolated is to close our eyes to the role of law in shaping attitudes, especially about who's worthy and who's not. My focus is on the immigration laws of the United States, and especially on how these laws have laid the foundation for hate crimes against Asian Americans in the past, in the present, but I hope not in the future. I'll start by observing that throughout our nation's history, immigration laws and statutes, regulations, and executive branch orders have discriminated and excluded on the basis of race, nationality, religion, and ethnicity. There are many examples. Chinese exclusion, as you've heard, dates back to the 1870s and 1880s, but it was the law of the land until 1943. My own family was one of the very small number of Japanese allowed to come to America before 1965, when immigration from Asia was severely limited. And similarly, the large undocumented population from Mexico reflects an immigration system that historically has treated Mexican immigrants as disposable labor, and today offers too few legal opportunities to work and live with family in this country. Most recently, many people have been barred from the United States because they come from certain majority Muslim or African countries. Now, immigration laws at their simplest separate them, in quotes, outside the border from us, also in quotes, inside the border. And this may be why public figures have felt free to disparage and insult people from certain other countries, even when some of those same public figures might never say the same thing about U.S. citizens who trace their family roots to those very same places. But immigration laws don't just affect people outside the United States. Immigration laws can make it hard or even impossible for some U.S. citizens, but not others, to live in this country in their United States with their spouses and children and other close relatives. In other words, to make a family here, to make a life here in this United States as a family. In this way, immigration laws tell some U.S. citizens they're still foreigners, that they cannot fully partake of American life. If they trace their family origins to disfavored parts of the world, or if they follow a disfavored faith, then the message is that their citizenship isn't as worthy of respect as the citizenship of other Americans. Their citizenship is devalued. In these ways, immigration laws enable discrimination that's based on race, often against U.S. citizens. Chinese exclusion, for example, was rooted in the idea that people of Chinese descent could not become fully equal citizens of this country because they're not white. When 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of whom were U.S. citizens, were incarcerated in relocation camps during World War II, this too was only possible because they were seen as foreign because of their race. So especially when this permission to discriminate is embraced, endorsed, and amplified by public figures, what happens next should come as no surprise. The message is that some U.S. citizens don't belong, that they're really foreigners, and that their lives and property aren't worth as much. That message leads to hate crimes against people cast by our American immigration laws as fundamentally less American. No hate crime is an isolated act. We need to take national responsibility for the role of law and what we're seeing today. By discriminating in ways that suggest some U.S. citizens don't belong here, our immigration laws have laid the foundation for hate crimes. And as long as our laws continue to lay this foundation, our entire country will suffer because the promise of a shared citizenship that can unite us all will remain unfulfilled. Thank you.
And thank you, sir. We appreciate your attendance and your participation in our hearing. We will now enter a round of questioning, and we will be under the 5-minute rule ourselves. And I will begin by recognizing myself for a question. And I'd like to ask Ms. Lee, is there empirical or historical evidence supporting the claim that leaders promoting stereotypes or using rhetoric aimed at a particular ethnic racial group leads to increased levels of discrimination or violence against that group? Are there historical examples of this?
Thank you, Chairman, for that wonderful question. And the answer is clearly yes. There is unfortunately a huge amount of historical evidence. The record is very clear. We've got mayors of major cities. We have lawmakers in Congress explaining Asian people in the crudest, most racist terms. In 1876 in San Francisco,